Hi, I'm Pastor Amy. I'm here to report on some of what Discipleship Council has been up to over the past year. Just like many folks these days, it's hard to imagine that all that has happened within the past year between 2019 and 2020. 2020 just in itself has seemed long enough already. But if we cast our minds back a whole year in the world of what's been happening in worship and formation and care in the congregation, it's all the way back to last summer. And so when I think about some of the things that happened in 2019 and 2020, it started off with Pastor Megan's sabbatical and the way that we were able to come around and worship and have multiple voices in our worship experience over the course of last summer and fall. I think about in the past year the kinds of visual space that artists have created in our worship. I think about the banners and the paintings, the way they've set up our visual space. I think about the blessings that we've offered for families in our congregation. I think of all of the times with children. I think about the formation that's happened in Sunday school classrooms for both adults and for children. And then in recent months, of course, we've had to really pivot and think about what those things mean in a different way for when COVID came into our lives and we all of a sudden had to switch to meeting, to all of our gatherings being in an online format, to think about what Christian formation means, to think about what worship means and what's essential to us in worship. We had to engage creatively beginning in March to think about how we gather online. And even though we were mourning and are still mourning that we can't be together to celebrate meaningful things in person, we still get to have the gift of, for example, welcoming people from far from our community to be able to gather with those people in worship. And throughout this time, we've been keeping those in our midst who are most vulnerable at the center of our discerning for how and when we continue to gather in person, and that discernment is ongoing. So those are some of the things that happened over the past year. But the question that we're really called to engage as a community is how we've engaged the question of how we're a Jubilee community. So in Discipleship Council, there have been a couple of things. One, as a council, we engaged with the book Plantation Jesus, and in particular questions around how are the traditions that we hold dear in our community, both in our particular Mennonite church and in the church more broad. How is what we hold dear rooted in whiteness? What about the way we worship? What about the way we learn and teach? What about that is rooted in whiteness? And what can we keep and what can we examine? And maybe there are things that we can release. And similarly, how can we really live into our calling as Christians to be, as Mennonite Christians in our particular place, to be radically hospitable as we're called to. So those are some of the questions that we engaged in particular in Discipleship Council. Things like looking at our library, our resources, our art, and who's represented, who are the faces that we see, who are the writers who are on our shelves, who's creating the resources that we're engaging as a congregation. And then most lately in Discipleship Council, we've really been engaged and energized by the question of that Rebecca set before us. She was echoing a question that she heard in the context of her work, challenging funders. This is a challenge that she echoed to us from Tynesha McHarris of Funders for Justice and Janice Rochubel of the Solidaire Network. And there are links to both of those organizations in my newsletter this week, which you'll see in the e-communicator. But the question was, what are the rules that we are prepared to break in defense of Black lives? So in Discipleship Council, one of the ones that we really sort of got behind when we were asked that question is, what's the rule in worship about who should be in the pulpit? And one of the beauties of meeting on Zoom is that we're able to invite people from everywhere and anywhere to be preachers in our congregation. And there are so many Black preachers who already have work available on YouTube and to listen to. And so we're calling some of those folks into our pulpit, people from our own denomination, from our own Anabaptist tradition, and also people from across the ecumenical community. So some of those names that you'll see are Glenn Guyton. He's been our executive director of Mennonite Church USA for 2 years, but many of our folks, in our congregation won't have had a chance to hear or see him, so we'll hear him introduce himself in a sermon from Pasadena Mennonite Church from shortly after he became executive director. We'll hear from Jarrell Williams, who's a pastor in our conference of Pacific Northwest Mennonite Conference. He's a pastor at Salem Mennonite Church, and it was my blessing to be a part of the pastoral leadership team who affirmed him in his ministry. We'll hear from Oshita Moore, who Pastor Megan quoted a few weeks ago, inviting us to be accountable as white Christians, as white peacemakers. And she's a pastor in Minneapolis, in St. Paul. And then from other ecumenical traditions, Otis Moss III, Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III, who's a pastor in Chicago of Trinity UCC and well known for his prophetic preaching. We'll hear from Austin Channing Brown, whose book, I'm Still Here, many of us have read, about being a Black woman in a white world. And then from Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown, who's the lead pastor at Plymouth UCC here in Seattle. So we'll hear some of the stories of their experience as Black people in this world. We'll hear their challenge to the church, to our particular denomination, and to the church more broadly, and a challenge to act for justice and for equity. We're energized in this moment by this question about how do we act and live in defense of Black lives. But I can also see that we'll wear out, we'll get tired, and yet we have to continue to engage the question. And one of the things that really convicted Megan and me as we started looking at who we would invite into our pulpit is Drew Hart, whose book about The Trouble I've Seen also is a challenge to white Christians, to white Anabaptists. One of the things that he said in one of the talks that we saw was, white Mennonites, white Christians will say, oh, we'll just have a pulpit exchange, and that'll be the answer. So we didn't want to leave it at just a pulpit exchange. This isn't exactly an exchange, but we just didn't want to leave it there. We want to make sure that we continue to be challenged, that we take these questions about racial and equity and justice beyond the summer into the fall. Through this summer, we'll have a series of World Cafe inspired conversations during our education hour after worship, to be able to process some of what we're learning, to be able to talk with each other about the experience that we're hearing. And then we hope that going into the fall, we'll continue to be inspired to engage in questions of racial justice. How are we going to continue this movement that to have momentum, that it's not just now, that it's not just like a reactive response to this question, but that we continue to enact our Jubilee vision, to enact God's Jubilee vision for a just peace for all creation. I really look forward to doing this work with all of you, my family, my faith family, and to keep having these conversations on and on and on, and that we will inspire and engage with each other.